Okay, so let's look at the questions for discussion board 5. And first question from James. Both chapters outlined important considerations for teaching students at varying levels of proficiency and age within the classroom. Many of the techniques related to encouraging children and teens relied on concepts of team building. How can we encourage younger students to be confident and less self-conscious if instruction occurs on an individual level? Um, our difficult question to respond to because you've taken away the group situation, and now we're at an individual level. Often, I think, even you're thinking of contexts of private lessons, one-on-one, which in itself is a particular difficult task for especially children in that one-on-one situation. I think what we need in that situation, if you're in that situation, is plenty of time for students to work by themselves. Sometimes it's called seat time. So if we're in a one-on-one situation and we're engaging with students, we need to give students time to work by themselves. Um, that's a kind of an inadequate response to your question, but I think maybe you'll get some more answers when we look at some of the other questions. Casey says, do you have any experience or advice for working with second language learners who also have speech impediment or underlying issue that causes a speech complication? Um, that's a very interesting question. Often, as teachers, we're not aware of particular speech problems. We're not aware of maybe reading deficiencies in the L1 or instances of dyslexia. And knowing that can be very, very helpful. The one experience I have had is with teaching a blind student in a seeing classroom of students, and that was not too much of an imposition, but it certainly makes you think of all the different kinds of senses we bring to language learning and how we take for granted a lot of these particular senses. So we often take for granted that, of course, all our students will not have any particular impediments. Next question is from Catherine. Although the scenario is unlikely to happen, how can a language teacher accommodate students of different ages in the same class? For example, if there is an ESL class with mostly adults but a few teenagers as well. Also, I know from experience that even in the same level of a language, there can be students with very different proficiency levels. How can a teacher cater to those who may be behind while also keeping material challenging and interesting for more proficient students? The best way I've found of doing this is that when you're creating materials, then you create those materials with an understanding that there are mixed abilities in the class, mixed proficiencies, and that students go at different speeds. So that becomes a case of creating materials that have activities which are graded. So let's, for example, you have a reading comprehension. You might have, say, 6 particular tasks associated with that reading comprehension. And those 6 tasks can be graded from easy to difficult. So let's say you want everyone to say complete 3 of those activities. So the slower students can work at their particular pace, and faster students can always go on to activities 4, 5, and 6. It's very important not to have students sitting around having finished all the activities doing nothing. So keeping that in mind, if you do think of activities for reading comprehension, listening comprehension, or whatever that are graded in a way so that faster students can go on and complete them, but not all the class has to complete all the activities. What we're getting away from then is the notion of a lockstep class where everybody has to go at the same pace. Anthony asks, although having both young children and adults in one class is extremely unlikely, children below and above the puberty level of age 12 in one classroom is very likely. They have their own unique characteristics and needs that must be met. But how can you uniformly teach a class of this variety? Yeah, it's very difficult. And we're talking about children below and above puberty. Once they get to puberty and above, they tend to be getting more responsive to abstract notions of grammar. They have a certain amount of world experience so that they can role play. Um, whereas children who are not yet at puberty are are, are going to more readily respond to game type activities and situations. So the challenge is creating a balance of activities which allow students of different maturities to benefit from the class. And then going back to what I said before about creating kind of graded activities, and your graded activities here are going to be related to maturity. Um, Difficult thing to do, but building in these graded activities would allow students of certain maturities to go on ahead and perhaps do slightly different things as opposed to the students who are younger. Um, Bailey says chapter 6 talks about how when teaching children ESL, you have to walk a very fine line of keeping the content interesting and engaging enough for the students, while also ensuring that they are understanding and successfully acquiring the language. When teaching adults, however, the line between becomes little bit blurred when it comes to interest because they have more tolerance for somewhat boring activities like grammar and syntax. As someone who has to teach a younger ESL learner while also trying to accommodate adult ESL learners, how can I keep from boring the younger learner with subjects like grammar and syntax that the adult learners will have no trouble paying attention to? Again, think in terms of lockstep classes and non-lockstep classes, and how can you build in opportunities for students to go at different speeds and to do different activities. And this is kind of going back to what we've said already for a couple of these questions. So, for example, if you're doing a reading comprehension, listening comprehension, you can build in grammar activities which you're not requiring everyone to do, but they are there for the adults. And you can designate particular groups in your class and say, you do those activities, you do these activities. And in that way, you can begin to balance it. So think in terms of when your class is lockstep and when it's in more individualized, customized learning. So you're going to have to, and this is true of any particular class because all classes can be considered as being mixed ability, mixed maturity, mixed learning style, is to allow and think about when is your class lockstep. It's going to be very teacher-centered, and when is it going to be individualized, customized learning where you can go one-on-one with students and allow students to do different activities. Sarah says, and this follows on from a comment she makes, I thought the idea of not using too much abstraction was helpful. When I was teaching for the practicum, I often had issues using too many fake scenarios and could see my students getting physically uninterested in the teaching of these scenarios. So I know now that I have to make sure I am always or almost always connecting the concepts to real life situations. And the question is, as in my comment, I have issues using too many abstract generalizations. How can I work on not doing this as often and keeping the lessons more interesting, especially for children? One of the ways in which abstraction tends to come into a classroom is based on a particular approach. So, a deductive approach to grammar teaching, for example, is one where you give the abstraction, the abstract rule, and then you go practice the rule in particular sets of sentences, as opposed to an inductive approach is where you provide the actual data and then try to get students to work out what the rule is. So we know that deductive approaches don't really work with children, at least children under the age of 12, 13, 14. And gradually as they get older, their tolerance for grammar becomes greater, although not as great as, say, maybe an adult. um, one particular approach to avoiding abstraction is to think inductively rather than deductively. That is, doing a reading comprehension, and then perhaps looking at the content of the reading, and then uh, later looking at formal features like particular grammar. And that's an approach to teaching grammar. You're not forgetting about grammar, but it's not a deductive approach, it's an inductive approach. And quite rightly, you talk about authentic tasks and authentic materials. And these are, I think, very important for all students because they know when it's authentic, they know when it's something which is real. And so choosing authentic materials as much as possible becomes one way of avoiding the lurch to abstraction. Okay, thank you for those questions, and are looking forward to more in discussion board 6.